The Feudal Future Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today, Joel, we are going to attack the flip side of the issue we talked about a couple of weeks ago, where we did our podcast on Canada. We're going to be talking about Mexico. And to help us navigate what is happening in Mexico and attitudes in Mexico toward the U.S., we have two distinguished panelists. Bruno Lopez is a former journalist at CNN, ABC News, and Univision. And Alejandro Chaufen is an economist specializing in public policy and most recently the managing director of the Acton Institute. Gentlemen, welcome.
Right.
Joel, you want to kick us off?
Yeah. Obviously, we see that the great charm of Donald Trump has managed to elect a new prime minister in Canada whose interests are probably not aligned very much with the United States. Are we seeing a similar kind of pattern in Mexico and across Latin America where, you know, we've successfully alienated people that we historically had close ties to?
We just received a picture my son sent me in the storefront in the town where he lives that says "putos gringos," meaning screwed Americans, so screw Americans. So you see a lot of that. And the latest post, I think I mentioned a while ago, maybe the poll by Financiero has Mexicans having a bad attitude about the U.S. in a really high number. 80% hold Trump under negative view. The bilateral relation is seen horribly also. But who knows? Maybe that won't be a long-lasting effect. And then you saw, and I don't know if you saw this, Alejandro, this video. Homeland Security paid the Mexican TV to wear a 1-minute spot where they have, saying, if you come to the U.S., you'll be deported. We are fed up of having criminals. This is a quote from the video. We don't want any more criminals in the U.S., which to Mexico, that has, maybe 11 million Mexicans working in the U.S., is telling Mexicans in Mexico that their family and relatives in the U.S. are all criminals. I mean, it's just insult after insult.
Wow. And this is the Mexican television commercial that is aimed at Mexicans. Amazing. Alejandro, what's your take on all of this?
Well, have been board member of the most important think tank in Canada, Fraser Institute, since 1991. So we followed all this very carefully. Again, we were very active in promoting the North America Free Trade Agreement. We are big believers in the importance of free trade among free countries, and non-criminal actors. Canada and Mexico are very, very different. As you know, Canada is different, from the French part to Ontario and to Vancouver. I have been all over the place. And we were expecting a win by the Conservatives, and pretty sure they were running ahead. But again, Trump made what I think, was like a stupid remarks. He's non-ideological, unhinged in many ways. And but I think that Mexico is a different thing. I think it is a much more, both cultures are regarded as a little bit as docile. But I think, Mexico's population, I think will, I think when they follow their leaders and the relationship of their government with the United States, and if they seem to have a cordial relationship, they will again look well to the United States. Remember the enormous amount of remittances that come from the United States Mexican workers to Mexico. So I think what is good for Mexico is good for the United States and vice versa. So I think the wounds will take longer to heal in Canada than in Mexico. And so I think that's my view.
Well, and I really want to focus a little bit more on this economic side in a minute, but it would be very useful to get your perspective from a history perspective to see when in the past have relationships gone sour between the U.S. and Mexico, and what is this period that we're living through analogous to in past history?
I think, well, obviously Mexico suffered the invasions, lost part of the territory. I mean, you've had all this like really painful, traumatic experience for Mexico in terms of the relationship with the U.S. We went through this big crisis because of the killing of Enrique Camarena, the DEA agent who was killed in the early 80s and triggered an amazing amount of friction between the U.S. and Mexico. I think you have like cyclical stuff happening all the time. And what amazes me is that, Mexico tends to heal fairly fast. And maybe, like Alejandro was saying, maybe Mexico at the end has been more forgiven. But I think this in many ways is very different because it's like a huge betrayal of the U.S. towards Mexico and Canada. And I think, if anything, it will really make Mexico think, as probably will do with Canada, how the need to diversify all their commercial relationships, lessen their dependency on the U.S. Hopefully, as an outcome, I would think Mexico and Canada will start working together more, because one of the sad things was that during all the NAFTA negotiations in the 90s, and then afterwards, Mexico and Canada never really kind of aligned, because I think they were spooked about pissing off the U.S. But now it's, clearly, it doesn't make any sense for both countries to try and kind of keep the relationship with the U.S. as it is in the status quo situation. It's already proven that both countries are going to be kicked around anytime, so might as well start diversifying relations, trading, or hopefully our trade, Canada and Mexico, is still very low, 40 billion a year, compared to the 800 billion of the trade of Mexico with the U.S.
But I think that the thing that I think may be a bit of a problem, and I see this in Canada. I write for the National Post, so it's it's something that I'm actually writing as we speak, which is basically the temptation for both Canada and Mexico is to ally itself with China. Europe is increasingly a non-factor on a global level. Just it's working hard on irrelevancy. China is not. Do you see that as something that Mexico may be doing, and is there any danger in embracing China?
Let's go to Alejandro on that as the economics expert.
Well, China has become the leading trading partner of most Latin American countries. Right. And that has really changed the scenario. One of the few bipartisan topics that I find here in my neighborhood near Washington, D.C., is the danger of a world ruled by China and their style of operation. I think that the Mexican scene, with the power of the drug cartels and the whole crony capitalist structure and the hold that the government has on part of those problems, has made China sort of more careful in getting into Mexico. But now slowly they are beginning to invest, billions, in technologies that have to do with the car industry, in Nuevo León. And but I think the Mexicans also have to know that is an area where we're beginning to see major concerns in both parties in the United States, and much more action. The newly appointed ambassador to Mexico, Ambassador Johnson, is very savvy on topics of intelligence. The Undersecretary of State, Chris Landau, was a former ambassador in Mexico. So all eyes are going to be looking for any sort of type of malfeasance of China in Mexico and ways that China might use to circumvent any sort of final barrier that will remain after this beginning of a trade war. We do not know where it will end. No.
Well, and it sounds to me that it's.
I wanted to mention something on this. Also, recently, as part of the, appeasing Trump, Mexico started making it harder for Chinese investments to set their foot in Mexico. So you've seen some projects that had originally appeared to be being green-lighted for new plants in Chihuahua and Tamaulipas and kind of the border states by Chinese companies. Now they backtracked, and now they're saying they might not get approved. So,
well, they were concerned about.
Mexico wants to appease the US.
They were concerned about kind of beating the tariff problem, and what the Trump administration has basically said is, look, if it's made in Mexico, owned by a Chinese company, we're going to consider it Chinese. So this actually gets to a global security question that I think Alejandro was alluding to, which is right now the Trump administration has justified a lot of its actions on the basis of trying to get rid of the influence of drugs, the drug cartels, the, quote, criminal activity, et cetera. Do you think that this alignment with China and economic interests in China is going to open the door to a new line of argument from the Trump administration that basically says, oh, there's now a global security risk or a exigent risk to the U.S. from Chinese companies operating in Mexico?
Well, so, look, the concern goes up to Tierra del Fuego in the southern Patagonia of Argentina, now where the Chinese have major bases, one of the deep space listening plants or stations more powerful in the world, where they are building a port in Chancay in Peru, which immediately can be turned into military use. Remember that, unlike the United States, the whole Chinese economic apparatus is vertical, all responding to the Chinese Communist Party. So their concept of total diplomacy and can be turned into total war if needed. So there is deep concern all over the continent. And today, the general in charge of Southern Command is visiting President Milei in Argentina, who has become a staunch defender and aligning himself with the United States. So yes, it will be a concern if we see increased Chinese companies operating in Mexico. But again, the United States still trades a lot with China, so we cannot expect Mexico to be, more close borders with China than what we are.
Let's tackle the human rights questions that are very much in the news right now. The notion of people either self-deporting to Mexico or being swept up in raids. What's the sense of Mexican people in Mexico about this movement that's happening?
No, you see, well, yeah, as I mentioned to you a while ago, I mean, all this, last week they burnt a piñata outside of the U.S. Embassy in protest because of what's already happening in terms of getting people deported. I think you'll see different levels of concern. So you have a level of concern for those getting sent back to Mexico, but who are not Mexican, with expectation that Mexico will keep them there for a while. When Mexico has already become kind of, in a way, anti-immigrant. So some of those polls I was mentioning earlier.
People coming from like Central America, that's what, yeah.
Yes, there's already kind of a negative attitude in Mexico towards migration, either coming, using Mexico to cross into the U.S., but also fearing now with people getting deported, not only Mexicans, but everybody else, that all these people would be staying in Mexico. And Claudia Sheinbaum has already offered to, to have a humanitarian attitude towards them and to help them. But Mexico has become also very anti-immigrant. So I think the numbers were like 40%. This is the Pew Center poll. This is July of last year, in which about 40% of Mexicans thought the southern border was out of control, and about 30% of the people had very negative attitudes towards immigration. So you have both things playing. But also, remember what Alejandro was saying. You have $67 billion a year going into Mexico sent by Mexicans in the U.S. People in Mexico must be, or are, and have expressed, they're very scared what's going to happen with that money flow. That's
their lifeline.
Maybe Alejandro has a better number, but I think it's maybe like the second source of revenue for the country, or maybe even the first. I don't know, Alejandro. The money sent to the U.S. from the U.S. to Mexico, is that like the second or first money source for Mexico?
Around like 17%, I think.
17%. So can you imagine how scared everybody is that money will not flow into an economy where you already have a huge percentage of the population underemployed?
Well, one of the ideas that's been floated is, instead of, clearly the Biden open borders gambit was not successful, to say the least. But it's clear that without Mexican and Latin American labor, much of the United States would be in pretty bad shape. So is there any notion that we may go back to more of a sort of, what the Germans would call Gastarbeiter kind of situation, where people will come in on labor, they won't bring their families, but they'll come here and work on the farms or in the restaurants or even in the factories, and then they could still have the remittances, but the U.S. and particularly the local communities will not be stuck with taking care of large numbers of people that they don't have the ability to do. Is there any way of finding a kind of something that works for both sides? I've heard some of the Trump people talking about this. How do you think that would be received?
That would be a good. I came into the U.S. the first time to work illegally. So it was a project I did for the Arizona Republic out of Phoenix. So I paid coyotes, crossed into Arizona, and I worked for a month as an illegal alien. And one of the things that the older people I was meeting used to tell me was that, so this is during the Simpson-Rolino days. This is in the 80s. So a lot of the older folks who were illegal were telling me that they were used to coming back and forth. But as they saw the border getting tougher to cross, they had started deciding not to go back to Mexico. So the only reason a lot of the Mexicans didn't want to stay in the U.S., they ended up staying because they could just be coming back and forth. A Bracero program like the one, Alejandro, I think the Bracero program was in the 60s or 40s. I can't remember when we had a Bracero program. People could come and work and then go back.
Definitely during World War II on a large scale.
Yeah. I think something like that probably would work. And as I say, the majority of the people, all the people that I crossed with 7 people illegally in the Nogales border. None of them wanted to stay in the U.S. They were all wanting to go to the U.S., work for a little while, and then go back home.
But I worked a lot in this area. President Fox, although I'm not Mexican, put me in the Instituto Mexicanos en el Exterior, the Mexican Abroad Institute, and we have programs in Mexico promoting at the time immigration by invitation. Unlike the Bracero program, that was a government program. We're promoting immigration run by the private sector, that it will not guarantee citizenship, but it will give you all the legal protections to those who were coming from Mexico. When during the Bracero program, illegal immigration almost disappeared. And again, it's the fragile situation for human rights of illegal immigration. We cannot neglect that. Also on human rights, correct? Under all human rights standards, Mexico scores much lower than the United States. And the smuggling and the human trafficking that was taking place during all this period of political encouraged invasion to our country, really has created a tremendous backlash and attitude towards immigration. Recently, in Mexico, they've discovered this cartel ranch, in Teuchitlan. It's really, the way that people live in a country where big areas are handled by the drug cartels in cahoots with the military. It's a drama. So hopefully, both countries will improve in their relationship. I will begin push again for this immigration by invitation program. We used to call it the red card solution, because I think it's a humane, it's totally consistent with rule of law and consistent with the tradition of the United States of welcome immigrants like me.
Well, it's also something that I think people don't recognize, that Mexico, I heard President Fox speak not long ago, and, he was making the point that Mexico now has a low birth rate and will be facing labor shortages of its own in the foreseeable future. So maybe we ought to just think about this in a much less ideological way and more about a practical way. Part of the problem when you talk about illegal immigration to Mexico, it reminds me very much of our show on South Africa, where there's also a big backlash in South Africa from immigrants coming from other parts of Africa. So, the question is, can we come up with a set of policies that allow for, some legal immigration, but also for many people? Because, I could see very well if I'm coming to the United States and I'm working for a couple of years and I'm making $50,000 doesn't make that much of a difference here. But if you bring that back to rural Mexico, you can live pretty well. I've been in Mexican towns where they say, "Oh yeah, he went to Texas for 20 years and now he's living in a way he couldn't." What I'm hoping is that we can move towards some sort of solution that will respect the individuals, but also respect both countries. And I'm just hoping that maybe we can start moving in that direction, because what we're doing now is clearly not working.
Look at all the people who left the U.S. to go to Mexico. The latest numbers from the State Department, you have now 1.6 million U.S. citizens living in Mexico, 70% of which actually arrived in the last 3 years, because it's just so inexpensive.
Well, that brings up an economic.
Some of them are illegal, by the way. I heard the number maybe could be up to like 30 or 40,000 U.S. citizens living illegally in Mexico. None of them are.
But if you self-deport, you may be able to go back to Mexico someday. This brings up the larger economic development question. We've been focused heavily on the U.S. and its relationship with Mexico. I'd actually love to flip the lens a little bit and talk about Mexico from its own self-interest perspective. So as countries develop, traditionally they move from a very basic agrarian world to a basic industrial world to a services-driven world, right? That's kind of the pattern that we see throughout history. Where is Mexico on that continuum? And how does this play into Mexico's development scenario?
Well, Mexico,
Alejandro, you're probably better equipped for that one.
Mexico follows that pattern. You described it well. Yes, economies develop. They become much more diversified and focus on services. I think that's one of the strengths of Mexico, is that it has a very large, undiversified economy. So that's a plus. But
we were agrarian, no? Up to the 70s. I think 75% of the country lived in the rural areas, and now I think it's completely the other way around.
And the development that started in the north, even before the North American Free Trade Agreement, the whole maquiladoras as assembly plants and universities and efforts, in Nuevo León and Monterrey, that paved the road to diversified also a little bit political power away from Mexico City. The problem is that despite the more prudent macroeconomics, of Mexico, in the last decade, Mexico is perhaps in the largest economies of the world, is one of the ones that grew the least. This year, they are forecasting almost no growth in Mexico. I think Germany is one of those similar cases, but in
Canada as well, actually.
And in Germany we see some political change. Mexico, I think that's why I think that the population is sort of used to that sort of stability that I don't like. But Mexico should be growing much more. But look, inflation is pretty sort of in control, 4%, less than 4% a year. Unemployment is very low in Mexico, so they have everything that should allow it to grow. The problem with Mexico and most of the world is that the master key of economic development is rule of law. And in Mexico, the reform of the judiciary, I think, will make people more afraid to go against the government and demand more radical reforms. So I see, tremendous potential, but the weakness in the rule of law, and then this new political scenario of a confrontational United States will make it, I think, more difficult for Mexico to return to higher rates of growth.
Also, Alejandro, just the murder rate related to drug trafficking. Mexico is a country where you've had an average of 35,000 people killed every year, the last 5 years or 10 years, because of drug trafficking, where you only see maybe 3% of those homicides being resolved. The ranch that Alejandro was mentioning, that looked like it was Auschwitz. They found like clothing of children and suitcases and stuff of hundreds of people who had been executed by the cartel, I think was a Nueva Generación de Jalisco cartel. So, how can a country be viable with that huge amount of violence? There are parts in Chiapas. I traveled with my cousins in Mexico maybe 3-4 years ago. I couldn't go now anymore. They're now controlled by different cartels. Even an archaeological zone we went to called Toninab, you can't even drive there anymore because it's controlled by one of the cartels.
So what's the solution to that, though? Is it, you would think if this were here,
right,
there would be an assertion by federal government, by the state governments, and you're pointing out that the federal government is kind of in loose alliance with the cartels because of the crony capitalism kind of history. How do you solve that problem?
It's obviously, the issue is impunity. And how do you get Mexico to not enable impunity? I think, one of the, with anything I kind of sympathize is what's the pressure on Mexico because of the flow of fentanyl. And it has actually forced Mexico to crack on some of these cartels. It's still kind of directional data that I've seen for the first quarter of this year, but the level of fentanyl seizures and the number of labs getting seized by the Mexican government is already, just in the first quarter of the year, is already higher than whatever they captured in all of 2024. I think Mexico will only end up reacting to huge amount of pressure external, like the one exercised by the U.S. And I think it's very hard for Mexico on its own to break this. What do you think, Alejandro?
Well, it's such an difficult issue. If I want to practice the preferential option for the poor, I would begin by giving personal security to the poor. That they can go to school not with the fear of someone will try to make them drug addicts or put them into sexual traffic. I'm a good friend of Eduardo Verástegui, who did the wonderful movie Sound of Freedom, and he's trying to create a new political movement in Mexico. I don't know if we can create like islands of sanity in Mexico and start, by a different region. I will mention a name that frightens almost any policy analyst in my side of the libertarian world, the President Bukele from El Salvador. who in short time turned, killing fields into killing poverty, and turned one of the most difficult countries in the world into a much more safer place. But again, he has been doing that sometimes, going against the rule of law. So, so that is my concern, but the flow, by stopping the flow of illegal immigrants from other countries going through Mexico, which were being abused and trafficked, and the whole human rights abuses of all that traffic, that should make a little bit easier, the controlling some of the big dramas that have been taking place during these years. Regarding foreign pressure, there is a fear in the United States and other that sometimes this is a selective sort of witch hunt done by governments, that they will try to use this crackdown to punish political enemies. But again, it's a risk that perhaps is worth taking. I think Latin America as a whole, not only Mexico, needs to improve, in the area of rule of law and personal security.
Well, as we get close to our end time, I've got a question for both of you. Net, how optimistic are you about the future of the U.S.-Mexican relationship and Mexico as a healthy political and social environment?
I mean, obviously, Mexico has been hugely resilient. As I say, it lost, in multiple invasions, so, half of its territory. It's gone through a horrible crisis. Had a dictatorship, a virtual dictatorship with the Revolutionary Institutionary Party for so many years. Came out of it, became kind of a semi-democratic country in many ways. The place is still growing. It's become such a capital for expats. There's so many, as I was mentioning, people from Europe and the U.S. moving into Mexico. These cities are vibrant. You go to Mexico City. It's a city in the world with the largest number of museums, close to 70, has 5 orchestras. Compared to Miami seems like a village compared to what Mexico City is.
Yes.
So I think you have a country that will be vibrant, and all this is happening despite all the violence that you see and all the people getting killed. And I just think Mexico is very resilient. I would be surprised, and maybe it's more my wishful thinking, I would be surprised that the bilateral relationship just goes back to normal. I would think this would be a signal, like it was for Canada, that things have to change dramatically for us, for Canada and for Mexico to be more resilient in terms of their economies, and not to just be subject to being virtually dismantled financially when the U.S. just desires to do so.
Last word to you on this, Alejandro.
Well, I think we should be natural partners, the Mexicans and the United States. I think that if we work to improve an understanding of both cultures, and especially now at government levels, I think that there is a degree of feeling that the Trump administration can work with President Sheinbaum. And I think we are going to be seeing in second levels of diplomacy people trying to build bridges. But again, this first 100 days of Trump, we have no idea how much it is posture and how much it is really a negotiating tactic, or how much really is a change in philosophy. So I want to be optimistic. I think that Mexicans, especially Mexican men in the United States, are very hardworking and very conservative, and that we can have some reasons for optimism, but again, we have challenges in both countries, and I hope for the best.
I just want to add one last point, which is, and I think something that may be optimistic, which is that the enormous influence of Mexicans and people from the Hispanic America is so enormous in the United States. We're talking about 30% of the population by 2050. We're talking about most of the new businesses that have been formed. A very strong, growing Mexican American middle class, which is becoming very dominant in a lot of our suburbs. So I'm hoping somewhere in that confluence of Latino America and Latin America that we will find some sort of balance in some sort of way that these two cultures can interact in a positive way, because, as in the studies that we're doing at Chapman and also at the University of Texas, there is no future for America unless it's somehow integrated with this large new population. And that may be the bridge that leads to better relations in the long run.
Can I pass you a message? This is a scholarly message, because I think can lead to unity. Next year, we're celebrating 250 years, of the founding of the United States. And there was a major contribution from the Hispanic culture that Mexican scholars of the 16th century contributed to create the basis of what we know now is the constitutional order of the United States. There's something called the School of Salamanca, and Mexico had a major scholar like Fray Tomás de Mercado, a Dominican, who were great champions of rule of law and the market economy and the free economy. And some of us believe, that the first constitutions of the United States were inspired by the Hispanic scholars. John Locke was only 6 years old when the fundamental orders of Connecticut were drafted. So there's a group of hundreds of scholars that next year and beginning soon, we are trying to highlight the importance of the Hispanic and contribution to the United States rule of law. And perhaps that diminishes some of the stigma that some of the people today are putting upon us, those of Hispanic origin or Latino origin.
By the way, I don't have the same hope that you expressed in terms of the Latinos in the U.S. And it has to do, for the last elections, I did phone canvassing for the Democratic Party. And I was talking to Mexicans who couldn't even speak English, who were U.S. citizens who were going to vote for Trump. So I think we tend to think that maybe Hispanics in a way might be progressive in one way, or might be more considerate with immigration and with immigrants. But I think those who already arrived and are here tend to want to see the doors closed, locked, not seeing more people coming in. There's less level of sympathy. You can see it now in Miami. Hialeah, not actually in Doral, which is where like 30 or 40,000 Venezuelans live. I mean, they just did a partnership with ICE, and they're rounding up people to get them deported. Although, the people getting deported are those Venezuelans that are here, that the other Venezuelans who may be already U.S. citizens or legal residents should be more sympathetic with, but they're not. I think you have this horrible complex of, the incumbents, they're already here. They have kind of their stuff more or less solved. They don't care about
and I think that,
or a lot of them.
I think that attitude of wanting to preserve their own success is something that Trump was very astute in tapping into. And I think it had a major impact on the recent election.
So, anyway, what we really, I think we need to do is to really look at how the U.S. Integrates not just externally, but internally with this new population. And I think that one of the reasons for the hostility towards immigration is a lot of the people crossing the borders weren't Mexicans. They were from other countries. If you think about it, a lot of Mexican Americans work in fields where a large number of new entrants who are not legal is not necessarily in their interest. So anyway, I mean, I think this has been more hopeful than I expected. And
and thank you so much, both of you, for your time and your sage comments and for being guests on the Feudal Future podcast. We'd love to have you back.
A pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good luck.
The Feudal Future.